There's a lot going on this time of year at the Idaho State House. Committee meetings, bill proposals, and key debates that could shape Idaho's future. I'm James Dawson, state government reporter for Boise State Public Radio, and I spend my days from January to April sorting through the action at the legislature so you don't have to. Sign up for my weekly newsletter, Legislative Roundup, and you'll get each week's biggest news and developments from the session delivered straight to your inbox every Monday morning. Sign up for Legislative Roundup at our website, boisestatepublicradio.org.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. This morning, officials in Lubbock, Texas, confirmed the death of an unvaccinated school-age child from the measles. The West Texas region is experiencing a growing outbreak with more than 120 cases reported so far. 18 people have been hospitalized. All of them are between the ages of babies and 17 years old. Now, according to the CDC, this is the first measles death in the United States since 2015. So what do we all need to know about this outbreak? Well, joining us today to talk more about this is Dr. David Pate. He is the former CEO of St. Luke's Health System and the co-author of the book, Preparing for the Next Global Outbreak. Hi, Dr. Pate.
Hi, Gemma.
And folks, remember, if you have a public health question for Dr. Pate, send us an email at idahomatters@boisestate.edu. So, Dr. Pate, this is tragic. When this alert came over my phone this morning, I really just had a visceral reaction to this of just sadness. We should note, as I mentioned, that all of these cases, and health officials in Lubbock, Texas, confirmed today that all of these cases are in children. We're talking 62 cases between the ages of 5 and 17, 39 cases among children 4 and under. Talk to us about your thoughts when you found out about this.
Oh, terribly sad, though not surprised. Unfortunately, last week, as I was watching those numbers of cases increase by the day, I knew this day was coming. If you look at measles infections, you expect about 20%, 1 in 5 children will have to be hospitalized. The CDC reported last year that for those children under 5, it was more like 43%. So approaching half of those children would have to be hospitalized. And many times that's for breathing problems. These children can get pneumonia with measles. That is very serious. And eventually, about 1 in 1,000 will die. And of course, the way this outbreak is growing, I suspect there's many more cases than what we're aware of. And there will be more as more and more cases are discovered and tested. So, it's a terribly sad day. And it's not that children don't occasionally, there aren't stories of children dying of various things as children. That happens. But as you said, we haven't had a death in a child from measles since in years. And in fact, this was totally preventable. Those are the cases that make me the saddest, that child probably had no input into whether he or she was going to be vaccinated, and yet he or she paid the price. And I also want to say my heart goes out to the parents. What we have found with the COVID pandemic and others is that once this happens, the parents find out that it actually happened to their child and could have been prevented, they have tremendous grief and regret. We saw this with the measles outbreak last year in Ohio, some parents that lost a child, and then it was so sad seeing them go to the airwaves to tell other people, look, don't fall for this scam like we did. Get your kids vaccinated. It's terribly sad.
And we should note, Dr. Pate, measles was declared eliminated from the United States back in 2000, and this was because of a highly effective vaccination program. However, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have said due to low vaccination rates, you know, it's no longer eliminated. Again, when we go back, 25 years, we had eliminated this. What is that like as a health professional to know that a disease like measles was literally not in the United States 25 years ago?
Yeah, it's terribly frustrating. If you look at before the vaccine, just in the United States, we would have about 48,000 people hospitalized each year. 48,000. And about 4 to 500 children would die every year in the United States. We then got this vaccine, and for all the complaints about the COVID vaccines, this vaccine actually is close to 100% effective, especially if you get 2 doses. And it is lifelong protection. So all the complaints that we're hearing about why the COVID vaccine is so bad, that doesn't apply to this one. What has harmed this vaccine more than anything has been the misinformation that was it was particularly promulgated by a physician who reported fraudulent research data, but then perpetuated by anti-vax organizations such as the one that RFK Jr. runs that have perpetuated this myth that the MMR or measles vaccine causes autism when we have performed many well constructed large scale studies that shows it is just not the case. In fact, as we come to understand autism, we now understand that's something that starts in the womb before these kids ever get their first vaccine. And so this is a terrible shame. And unfortunately, it's just so frustrating because young doctors today have never seen a case of measles unless they've gone outside of our country.
Mm-hmm. I have to tell you, Dr. Pate, when the alert came over this morning, I happened to be driving my youngest kid to school. We were at a stoplight, folks. I wasn't looking at my phone when I was driving. And he looked at me and he says, "What's the measles?" I mean, that to me was, and so I told him about it, but it's because he's vaccinated. And I said, "Yes, you're vaccinated." And so that was just surprising to me that he didn't know what it was. But going back to your point that young doctors haven't seen this, I mean, it's because it was eliminated in 2000 in the U.S.
Yes.
With that said, can you talk to us about just how contagious measles is? This is something that I'm just learning more about. And because the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention states that just one infected person can spread this to 10 close contacts. So can you kind of compare this? I mean, everyone's familiar with COVID.
Right.
Can you kind of compare the difference between how contagious COVID is compared to the measles?
Right. So measles is the most contagious virus that we know of. It's more contagious than the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID. It's more contagious than Ebola. It is the most contagious. Now, here's the thing about it. So if you look at if somebody gets measles and they then are surrounded by people who are not protected, how many people would they infect? And we call that the reproductive number. So how many susceptible people would one person infected infect? The answer to that is it ranges between 12 and 18. If we were to look at SARS-CoV-2 that causes COVID, that number would be more on the order of 2 to 3. So it is far more contagious. And as a point, if that person is in a room that's infected with measles, is in a room with 10 susceptible people, we would expect 9 of them to come down with measles. That's how infectious this is. It's also so infectious because it spreads airborne, not just the droplets that we've talked about in the past, but airborne, meaning that if you walked into a classroom and there was somebody with measles in that room, even if you were sitting all the way across the room, far greater than 6 feet, you would be vulnerable. In fact, we have now shown that virus is so contagious that even if it was the previous class and that child left the room and it's been an hour since you now enter the room, you could still get infected.
And even if someone doesn't die from measles, can you talk about the real lasting effects of measles? I mean, we're talking about things like deafness, fertility issues. I mean, I had a PE teacher in high school whose husband was deaf, and she said, well, his mom had measles when she was pregnant with him. And that has just stuck with me all of these years.
Yes, and so a lot of folks our age, Gemma, may remember that there were many places that developed schools for the blind or schools for the deaf or schools for the deaf and blind. And a lot of that was because before vaccines, so many mothers were getting infected while they were pregnant, and measles, the German measles, and other viruses were causing deafness and blindness in those infants when they were born. And so those schools emerged as a need to take care of all of these children with these congenital birth defects due to the mother getting infected, particularly in the middle of the pregnancy. But that's not all. So one thing that, because we're not just having an outbreak in Texas, there are outbreaks in other parts of the country. And I have received alert from some physicians that they are seeing more cases of a rare complication that we generally don't see, and thank God I've never seen, but of acute necrotizing encephalitis, which is worse than it sounds, where basically the virus is infecting these children's brains and just causing destruction in their brains, causing very severe illness and death. And so there's two other things that people often don't know about measles. One is that even when you recover from measles, and that's the biggest argument, people like RFK Jr. say, hey, most people recover from measles and they're just fine. True. However, there are two other consequences. One is that measles virus can hang out and cause an immune issue in the brain that is unknown to you. You think your child has gotten over the measles, is fine. And then 3 to 7 years later, all of a sudden, your child starts losing memory, being unable to communicate clearly, and just deteriorates quickly, and in 100% of cases dies. Thank God this is a rare complication, but that's one thing that can happen. The other thing that is far more common, in fact, perhaps occurs in as many as 85% of these children after they recover from measles, is that for up to 3 years, they develop what we call immune amnesia, meaning that the measles virus actually infects some of your immune cells, and particularly the type that make antibodies, and it wipes out those antibodies that you already had. So like this child that died today, unfortunately, we're told at school age, so we've got to assume the child was over 5 or 6. All of those antibodies that child may have already made based on prior exposures could be wiped out and may not reoccur for several years. And we notice this because if you look at the death rates of children after measles, it's higher than expected for several years. And that led us to this discovery.
Dr. Payne, I want to talk next about the cabinet meeting of President Trump's first cabinet meeting this morning, because Health and Human Service Director Robert Kennedy Jr. was asked a question about this outbreak in West Texas and this death. he appeared to downplay it. And I say that because I'm going to quote him. He says, quote, "It's not unusual. We have outbreaks every year," unquote. I want to know your thoughts on this because we have had outbreaks every year or in recent years. But when we look at last year, there were 16 outbreaks. There were 285 cases in all of those outbreaks combined. We are at more than 120 cases in West Texas. And that doesn't include the cases in the neighboring state of New Mexico that are right across the border. So how seriously should we all be taking this particular outbreak?
Well, we should be taking this very serious because I think this is far from over, this particular outbreak. But I also think that this is just the beginning of the problems we're going to see. Measles outbreaks are your first indicator that vaccine levels among children are too low. It will not just be measles. We will now start seeing other things. And in fact, Gemma, you and I have already talked about other outbreaks that we've been seeing here in Idaho that we shouldn't be seeing. Like we talked about a big pertussis outbreak last year. We've talked about a measles outbreak here in Idaho. These are just the warning signs of what's coming. There's going to be more vaccine preventable illnesses that cause outbreaks. And I fear that we're going to see the resurgence of another disease that we eliminated from the United States, and that's polio. That may take a while, but be on the lookout. As far as RFK Jr.'s comment, I think it's tragic to minimize this. If this had been his grandkid, I'm sure he would think it was a big deal. But it's somebody that probably he doesn't know, doesn't care about, and so he doesn't think it's a big deal. Well, if you have ever been in a situation like I and other doctors have been where we see the child of loving parents die, you would know every one of those is a huge deal. And I think that this is a common trait among those that want us to abandon public health measures is to minimize, to indicate, well, most everybody does fine, or it's no big deal, or it's just like the flu, or we've heard all kinds of lines, but they won't acknowledge and recognize these terrible losses of life and the terrible complications. And again, the reason it's especially such a big deal is because it is preventable.
Dr. Pate, before we take a break, how important is it for people to understand the need to get the MMR vaccine, the measles vaccine, even if they've been hesitant, right, with their children? And we can understand, I think many reasons why people may be hesitant. But as you said, the measles vaccine is a lifelong vaccine, almost 100% effective.
Yes. Well, first of all, I never blame the parents. They are victims of this misinformation and disinformation campaign. Who I blame are the leaders and the doctors who are spouting this nonsense, who know better. They are doing this for personal benefit. And to me, that is against every value in my being, both as a person and as a physician. So the parents I see as victims in this. But it is incredibly important to get the MMR vaccine. First of all, as you said, it is close to 100% protective. If you get one shot, about 93%. If you get two shots, as recommended, 97% protection, and essentially for life. So that's a good thing. The other thing is incredibly safe vaccine. Kids can get local reactions, sore arms, redness, all those kind of things, but we don't see serious problems from the MMR. And Please, if you don't believe me, do your own research, but do it through credible sites, scientific sites. The autism myth has been thoroughly debunked. So please get the MMR if you've not gotten it for your kids, and realize that apparently we're going to be facing the next 4 years of efforts to systematically dismantle public health and vaccines, which means the risk to your children and your grandchildren is only going to increase as more and more people listen to these sources that spread disinformation and convince more and more parents to abandon getting these vaccines. It's going to place your children at more risk, especially those very young children before they're even eligible for vaccination.
I do want to get to a question that we got just recently from Richard. He says, my sister contracted measles in Idaho Falls sometime between 1959 and 1962. Do you know how different, if at all, this current strain is from the strain that my sister had?
So I have been looking on the CDC and the Texas public health sites, and I have not seen that they have identified the genotype or clade for this virus. With the measles virus, we don't technically call it strains, we call it clades, but it's, for your purposes, the same thing. There are 8 different clades or strains and about 23 different serotypes, meaning that we can identify them differently based on different antigens and antibodies responses to them. But the good news is almost all outbreaks in the United States throughout history have been the B3 type. And regardless of type, it appears that the vaccine is protective against all of them because it focuses on an area that is highly conserved between all these different forms, meaning that it's pretty much the same in all of the viruses. So she would not have to worry about getting reinfected. In fact, she should be protected for life from the infection, but you would as well from the vaccine.
So I want to talk next, Dr. Pate, about the fact that you testified at the State House last week, and this was, and you testified before the Senate Health and Welfare Committee about Senate Bill 1036. Before we get into your testimony, can you remind us what this bill is and what it would do if passed?
Yes, this was a bill that was to place a 10-year moratorium on quote unquote gene therapy products. The problem was the definition for gene therapy products was not what we use in the medical or scientific communities. It was far more broader. It would encompass things that aren't gene therapy. In fact, in the original bill, basically, it would have meant you couldn't have a blood transfusion in Idaho for 10 years, or the farmers who made beef and chicken couldn't sell their meat in Idaho. That's how bad the first bill was. It got revised. But then at the testimony, it pretty much focused completely on the mRNA vaccines, which by medical and scientific standards are not gene therapy, but they're trying to make the case that it's gene therapy and they want to block it for 10 years. And of course, the concern is several things. One, that this could prohibit some things that everybody's in agreement we want to have. So it was too broad. But the second thing is we may be facing a bird flu pandemic. And if so, our only hope, at least early on, may be an mRNA vaccine, especially of concern when most estimates are that if this ever did take off in humans, we might see mortality rates in excess of 50%, and especially more in children.
So, Dr. Pate, can you talk about some of your testimony and some of your concerns? Because, and if you'd answer this question, because when I think of gene therapy, and tell me if I'm wrong, I think about, certain studies around cancer research, right? That we know that some cancers are genetic. So I even have a brother who passed away 8.5 years ago, tragically, from cancer. He was in a gene therapy study out of Johns Hopkins. Are these the kinds of studies that that this bill would say, hey, we're going to pause for 10 years?
Yes, there was an exception for cancer treatments, but gene therapy is just burgeoning now. When I was in training, there was a disease that I had to take care of a lot of patients with. That is a disease caused by a single amino acid mutation, a change that is caused in the genetic makeup of these people, and that disease is sickle cell anemia. Gene therapy has been used now to actually cure sickle cell anemia, something I never imagined was even a possibility. We're now looking at many other diseases where we might be able to cure. So, yes, when we talk about gene therapy as physicians and scientists, what we're talking about is altering the genetic makeup of a cell or a person so that it doesn't produce it doesn't express the part of the gene that causes disease. That is very different than what mRNA vaccines do. And this has been a popular line among the anti-vaxxers to label the mRNA vaccines as gene therapy. It's not, because mRNA is actually a product of the genes. And when you give the mRNA vaccines, it goes into the part of the cell that doesn't contain the DNA. So if you think about a chicken egg, you open the egg into your skillet. You're going to make scrambled eggs or egg over easy, whatever. You look at the egg, and the yellow part, the yolk, that would be the equivalent of the nucleus in the cell. That's where your genetic material, your DNA is. If you look at the clear, or if you started cooking it, the white part, that would be the cytoplasm. That's where the mRNA goes to. It cannot get to where the DNA is. And even if it did, it couldn't be integrated into your DNA for reasons we don't have time to explain right now. So this is a total fabricated misinformation thing, but that's what they are trying to do. And yes, gene therapy offers a great deal of hope. It's in its early stages, but certainly we don't want a moratorium on this for the next 10 years. That's not necessary.
Well, Dr. Pate, as always, so appreciate you and your scientific approach and facts to all of this. We'll, of course, have Dr. Pate back on with us next week. If you have public health questions for him, send us an email, idahomatters@boisestate.edu. You've been listening to Idaho Matters from Boise State Public Radio. I'm Gemma Gaudet.
Each morning, it's a new opportunity, a chance to start fresh. Up First from NPR makes each morning an opportunity to learn and to understand. Choose to join the world every morning with Up First, a podcast that hands you everything going on across the globe and down the street, all in 15 minutes or less. Start your day informed and anew with Up First by subscribing wherever you get your podcasts.